6 days in a row. So the people marched and marched all day long. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 whole days they marched and marched and marched and marched. Can you imagine marching every day for 6 days around a huge city? Well, do you know what happened on the 7th day? When the trumpet sounded and the people all shouted, God kept his promise. The walls came tumbling down. God drove out their enemies, and then God's people lived in the land that he had promised them. When Joshua was an old man, he reminded people to obey God's word. Choose this day whom you will serve. As for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. And the people all said, yes, yes, we will serve the Lord also. And on that day, many of God's good promises to Israel were fulfilled. Israel promised to be God's people. Israel promised to obey God's word. If they kept their promises, they would always live in God's promised place. Does this picture remind you of anything? Do you remember at the very beginning of our storybook that we've been doing, our storybook Bible, there was a picture of Adam and Eve in the place God had made. God has made this new place for God's people. It's not perfect, but it's God's place for them. But after Joshua died, Israel disobeyed God's word and rejected God from being king over them. So God punished Israel. He let their enemies rule over them. During this time, the Philistines ruled God's people. One of the Philistines was so big and strong that not one of God's people would fight him. Goliath was a giant. He stood over 9 feet tall. Goliath hated God's people, and all the men of Israel were afraid of him. All except for one. I bet you know who that is. David. David was from the little town of Bethlehem. David's belief in God's promise was big, and David's trust in God's word was strong. So David decided to fight Goliath. There he is. There's Goliath. He took out his sling and a few stones. And do you know what happened next? God kept his promise to rescue his people. The first stone that flew from David's sling, bam, hit Goliath right between the eyes. And David killed Goliath and rescued Israel from the Philistines. God was with David, and God gave David victory over his enemies in other battles. David, the mighty warrior, became king over God's people. David ruled over God's special place. Do you see? Here's David singing to God. He is thanking God for keeping his promises. Now that God's people were in God's place, it seemed that soon they would be a blessing to all the peoples of the earth. All right, on Wednesday, we're going to do the next page, which is God's blessings grow. God's people have finally arrived in the place that he originally promised to Abram. The people have grown into a big nation, and they have a good king, the good King David. Will they be a blessing to everyone like God promised? Well, we're going to find out on Wednesday around 3 o'clock. So